The cost of living has increased by 30 to 40% over the last 5 years, and that's according to official data. Everyone knows that costs have actually risen by much more, and for some, they've more than doubled. However, nobody seems to understand why the cost of living has risen so much, or when it will come down, if ever. And this has caused confusion and frustration as costs just seem to keep on rising. And that's why today we're going to explain why the official data undercounts these costs, what has caused the surge in recent years, and when and how costs could come down. My name is Nick, and you're watching Coin Bureau Finance. Before we start, you need to know that nothing in this video is financial advice. It's educational content intended to help you understand why the cost of living keeps going up and when it could come down. And if this is the kind of content you enjoy, then smash that like button, and if you want to get more of it, subscribe to the channel, ping that bell, and let us know in the comments what you want covered next. Now, let's start with why the official data undercounts the cost of living. The short answer is because it's objectively hard to calculate the cost of living, especially since it varies so much from person to person. And that's why there technically isn't a cost of living index, at least not yet. Instead, we have dozens of suboptimal indices that are supposed to measure inflation, such as Consumer Price Index or CPI. The CPI measures the rate of change in the cost of products like food and services like healthcare. The key word here is rate of change. The CPI could be going down, but prices could still be going up. For example, imagine the CPI goes up by 10% one year and then 1% the next. That doesn't mean prices went down by 9%. It means they went up roughly by 11% in total. And this is one of the reasons why those cost of living indices don't accurately reflect reality. Another reason is how these indices are weighted. For instance, the largest category in the US CPI is housing at 33%. And this means housing costs could increase a lot. But if everything else fell a little bit, the CPI would come in lower than you'd think. Yet another reason why the CPI and similar indices don't accurately reflect the cost of living is because of the so-called hedonic adjustments that it makes. Suppose the cost of an iPhone goes up by, say, 20%, but the battery size, memory, and performance improve by 50%. The CPI would say iPhone prices only rose 10% because the iPhone improved, so it offsets the cost. And no, I'm not joking. And it gets crazier too. Many have argued that the biggest reason that the CPI and similar indicators fail is because the way they're measured has changed many times, 13 times in the case of the US CPI. Not surprisingly, the cost of living is much higher when you measure it using the 1980s or 1990s version of the CPI, which you can actually find on Shadow Stats. Now, what is surprising is that the government institutions which publish the CPI have gone as far as to argue that the reason the older measures seem more accurate is because they're actually less accurate, and the reason the newer measures seem less accurate is because they're more accurate. In other words, older CPI measures overstated the cost of living, and the current ones are measuring it right on. But even though indicators like the CPI don't accurately reflect the cost of living, they're still directionally correct. If the CPI is rising, then the cost of living is probably rising. And if the CPI is falling, then the cost of living is probably falling. The exact percentages are likely off, and this is guaranteed when you look at things through an individual lens. Every person's cost of living calculation is different. But obviously, these nuances around individual differences in cost of living don't change the fact that literally everyone's cost of living has increased significantly in recent years, regardless of their location or socio-economic standing. And this is where the real craziness around the rising cost of living begins. It all starts with basic economics. The price of everything on the planet is determined by supply and demand. If the supply of something increases and the demand stays the same or decreases, then prices will fall. Conversely, if the demand for something increases and the supply stays the same or decreases, then prices will rise. And when we're talking about the cost of living on a global scale, the demand side of the equation is money, currency, and the supply side is products like food and services like healthcare. As such, all we need to do to figure out how much the demand side of the global cost of living equation has grown is to look at how much money has been created in recent years. As you can see, the global money supply has increased by around 35% since 2020, from roughly $80 trillion to over $114 trillion, and it's still rising. And this is the simple reason as to why the cost of living has risen so much and why it continues to rise. The supply side is where things get much more complex. To refresh your memory, the demand side of the global cost of living equation is the amount of money being created because it's used to buy stuff. The supply side of the global cost of living equation is, well, all the stuff itself: houses, cars, education, healthcare, food, energy, and so on and so on. And this is where dividing things into products and services becomes handy. You see, the price of products like TVs and phones has been declining for decades when you adjust for the growth in the money supply. To put this into perspective, some of you might remember how expensive those huge flat-screen TVs used to be in the early 2000s. And some of you might also remember how expensive cell phones were in the 1990s. And all these things cost much less today, at least relative to today's money. And the reason why products like TVs, phones, and computers cost much less is, of course, because their supply has increased exponentially, thanks to advancements in technology and the optimization of supply chains. Offshoring the manufacturing of these products overseas where wages are lower has also played a massive role, which we'll come back to a little bit later. Now, whereas the price of products has fallen in real terms, in recent decades, the price of services has risen, in some cases, exponentially. And that's because the supply of services hasn't increased nearly as much as the supply of products, which makes sense. It's much harder to build a new hospital and to staff it with qualified doctors than it is to build a new factory churning out millions of fridges and microwaves. The result is that the cost of services like education has increased exponentially, particularly compared to the cost of products like tables and chairs. Again, this is ultimately because the supply of products has risen faster than the demand coming from the newly created money, but the supply of services has not been able to rise as fast. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely why cost of living measures like the CPI are so bad at measuring the real cost of living. Recall that the CPI consists of different categories. At the highest level, the breakdown is roughly 44% products and 56% services. So, what happens when the price of products falls and the price of services rises? You get a CPI reading that suggests everything is fine, but on the ground you get a situation where buying a new pair of shoes or sunglasses can cost next to nothing, but getting even the most basic healthcare or education costs a fortune. It's fundamentally because the supply of products has kept up with the demand coming from new money, while the supply of services hasn't been able to. And it's even more true when it comes to things like cost of housing. And this is where the craziness of the rising cost of living turns into insanity. To quickly recap, the global cost of living equation consists of the demand side, which is the amount of new money, and the supply side, which is the amount of stuff, products, and services. So far, we've explained why the supply of products has risen a lot, but the supply of services hasn't risen as much. Now we need to look at the demand side. Why has so much money been created over the last few decades? At first glance, it's because there was a bunch of stuff governments needed to spend money on. Wars, pandemics, whatever, and that's true. But upon closer inspection, the specific reasons for that spending don't really matter. We're talking economics, not politics. So, how did governments manage to spend so much? 2 words: interest rates. You see, contrary to popular belief, most of the money in circulation is not printed into existence. It's borrowed into existence. The lower interest rates are, the more money can be borrowed. And if you look at every instance where governments spend a lot of money, it happened when interest rates were low, usually because the Federal Reserve lowered them during a crisis so governments could spend. And the catch is that governments don't only spend money during crises. They're spending all the time, and a big chunk of that money is coming from borrowing, 25% in the case of the US. So, why have governments been borrowing and spending so much, even when there isn't a crisis? The answer is because they can, and they can because interest rates were low for a very long time. And as you've probably noticed, we've been living in unprecedented times, and that also applies to interest rates. Never in history have we seen a period where rates were held near zero or even negative in some countries. But that's exactly what we saw during the 2010s. Interest rates had already been falling for decades prior, specifically since the 1980s. And it looks like they bottomed during the pandemic in 2020, and we'll come back to that in a second. Now, during this 40-year period, governments took on enormous amounts of debt to spend money, typically to try and get people to vote for them by promising benefits or tax cuts. But that's just the public sector. Borrowing from the private sector exploded too, because many people realized they could borrow at low interest rates and use that money to buy things like real estate or stocks. Put differently, people realized there were certain things, such as real estate or stocks, whose supply was growing much slower than the demand coming from all the new money being created. And those people did what any logical person would do. They borrowed as much money as they could to buy as many of these things as humanly possible, which is exactly why things like houses and stocks are so overpriced. Meanwhile, governments continued spending like drunken sailors, with all that money flooding into the economy and the markets via the individuals and institutions with the closest connections to government. Some of that government spending was spent on what it was supposed to be spent on, but much of it ended up in personal and corporate coffers and eventually into things with relatively fixed supplies. In sum then, the amount of new money has risen exponentially in recent decades because interest rates were low, and this made it possible for individuals and institutions to borrow unfathomable amounts of money, with most of it being invested into products and services with relatively fixed supplies, also known as assets. And this caused the price of those assets to rise, making things like housing extremely expensive. Say, if you are looking to buy assets, then check out the Coin Bureau Deals page. That's where we have numerous deals and bonuses on various financial platforms, exclusively sourced for viewers of this channel. And you can find those deals by scanning this QR code over here, or using the link in the description. They won't last forever, so take advantage of them ASAP. So, this brings us to the big question. When and how will the cost of living come down? And if you've been paying attention, you already know the answer. Either the supply of services like healthcare and assets like houses needs to increase substantially, or the amount of new money being created needs to decrease substantially so that demand of these things can fall. The bad news is that the amount of new money being created probably isn't going to decrease anytime soon. And this is because of the mechanism by which that money was created: debt. As with everything in existence, the value of currencies depends on supply and demand. If the amount of new money being created falls, that means less supply, which means the value of currencies would rise. And this would be good news for people living paycheck to paycheck, because their pay would be worth more in real terms. But it would be bad news for people who borrowed money to buy assets, because as the value of the currency they borrowed rises, so too would the cost of their debts. The outcome could be that they're forced to sell the assets they purchased to repay those debts. And this would cause the value of those assets to fall, which again would be good news for ordinary people because assets would become more affordable. But it would be bad news for people who borrowed money to buy those assets because all their wealth would disappear. Not to burst anyone's bubble, but the top 1% isn't going to allow that to happen so long as they can help it. The worst news is that even if the supply of services like healthcare and assets like houses could increase, what you get probably still won't be worth the cost. Government initiatives around housing actually come to mind here. Most involve fast-tracking the development of coffin-sized condos that cost the same as a house did a couple of decades ago. The average person won't be buying that. The good news is that there is one other way that the cost of living could improve without the supply of services and assets increasing or the demand from new money decreasing, and that's for real wages to rise. In plain English, it's for more of the newly created money to find its way into the pockets of ordinary people instead of the individuals and institutions closest to the source of that money. As we've learned, there are two places this newly created money can form: the public sector, in this case governments, and the private sector, in this case corporations. Public sector methods include lower taxes on the working class, more public services, or even direct stimulus like Universal Basic Income, or UBI, which is a topic for another video. Now, private sector methods mainly involve paying higher wages and giving additional incentives and benefits to workers. Corporations have actively avoided doing this for decades to maximize profits, and in turn the amount of new money others would invest into their stocks, perceiving them as superior. Today, however, corporations are realizing there's a growing shortage of qualified people to do the work needed for them to operate efficiently. And this is partly because many people feel there's no point in working hard since it's impossible to get ahead, i.e. buy assets like houses, and partly because there are simply fewer people due to the fall in birth rates caused by the rising cost of living. And this creates an interesting situation where corporations will likely be forced to pay their workers more and provide better benefits. Naturally, many corporations are trying to avoid this outcome with AI. And though AI may reduce the need for workers in some roles, it probably won't be enough to completely offset the demand for qualified labor, especially in higher positions requiring experience. Case in point, real wages have been growing in many countries in recent years, and in places like Japan, where birth rates are falling, corporations are giving massive pay raises and bonuses to keep their best workers simply because there is a shortage. It's almost as if the cost of living follows a cycle, just like everything else. And we've just been in the hard part of that cycle lately, and it could get worse before it gets better. And this brings me to the most important part of the video: what to expect for the cost of living in the coming years. To be blunt, it's probably going to be a slow and painful grind higher. We'll see a situation where the price of products starts to rise as quality jobs are brought back to the countries they came from. But the price of services remain elevated, including other assets like houses. The silver lining is that more of the new money should, keyword, should, flow into the pockets of the average person from both governments and corporations. And that's because the average person will demand these new money flows from governments at the ballot box. And corporations will be forced to pay higher wages and give better benefits due to the shortage of qualified labor. Unless, of course, there's some actual breakthrough in AI that makes workers obsolete, which is yet to be seen. The practical effect of this is that real prices should rise to keep up with most product prices, and services will become gradually more affordable. If we happen to get a massive market crash where over-leveraged players get wiped out, then the prices of assets like houses and stocks will start making more sense too. Just keep in mind this is a process that could take years, maybe decades to play out. In practice then, this means that if you want to keep up with the cost of living, you'll have to do the two things that not many people want to do right now. And that's work hard and put as much money as you realistically can into assets whose supply is restricted relative to the demand coming from new money. And if you fail to do the above, the next few years will be very hard indeed. Just saying. Okay, and if you want to learn more about the K-shaped economy we've been living in and are likely to continue living in, then be sure to check out our video on that right over here. And if you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel right over here. This is Nick signing off. Thank you guys very much, and I'll see you again soon.